Welcome to the Kids Cancer Therapy Toolbox podcast. This episode's guest is Benjamin Shiller, who's an economics researcher and parent of a childhood cancer survivor.
So I'm Benjamin Shiller. I often go by Ben. I'm happy to be on the podcast. I have known Charles for a long time. I am in my work an academic, specializing in economics at Brandeis University. But I'm also very deeply involved in sort of caring about the mission that you have there as a parent of my son, who's actually done quite well despite sort of scary diagnosis. Um, so happy to be here.
Yeah. So, my first question is, how would co-developing drugs for adults and children at the same time work? And what are the benefits?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you think of some of the immediate benefits that it's just more data, right? Some of these diseases, it takes a while to get enough people enrolled into the various trials, and it could help the drug companies in that way. But more than that, I think it's really important to think about the human aspect of this. These kids are often just completely overlooked, right? They're not necessarily the most profitable demographic because some of these cancers are very rare. I think of, rhabdomyosarcoma. There's about 300 cases a year in the US. It's not a huge market. And so they get overlooked, but many of these same drugs that are already being purposed for these adult cancers can really make a difference in kids' lives. I think there are parents who are desperate to get a chance. They just want a chance to have this life-saving treatment.
Yeah, that's great. On the other hand, do you think there are any downfalls such as increased cost?
I mean, it really depends on whether it's viewed as somewhat separate or they can be sort of pooled into showing the effectiveness. Um, Usually, additional participants, I think, will make any study more expensive. But you know, it depends if they have to be viewed as separate pools. If they're viewed as the same pool, then it can shorten the time of the study, which could actually save costs. So, you know, it's I haven't done this myself. Like I don't run these types of experiments myself, but I think if you're just looking at the theory of it, it can make it more expensive, but it could also go the other way. And it might have sort of no impact if they're sort of treated as just another data point with the same weight as you would get from an adult. Um,
Right. And how would pediatric patients in those clinical trials be treated differently?
well, um, I think one of the needs for these drugs or for more options for drugs is because these kids do have a long life ahead of them. I think sometimes the drug companies are concerned about the the appearance if anything goes wrong with a kid, but I think we have to try and make these options available to them because I think we want to have the greatest expected benefits to kids, and I think that the benefits far outweigh the risks. And I think getting access, especially to drugs that might do less damage to the body, you have to remember these kids, their cells are still dividing and expanding. And so the harsh impacts of chemo can have a much larger impact on kids than they can on adults. Certainly things like radiation. Radiation in particular is really bad for kids. And so, various uh, medicines that might be able to treat it would be sort of much preferred than the DNA damaging radiation. And so I think we need to think about the fact that these kids have, very long lives ahead of them, that at least in terms of years of life, gain can be substantial. And any treatment that might help them, I think I would place even more weight on kids. So I think it can be extremely helpful. How differently they should be treated, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of drug companies out there that are scared to try drugs on kids. But for parents who have limited options and their kids have poor diagnoses, I think they want it. I think they'll happily get their kids in the trial. They'll take the risk because the benefits are just enormous.
Right. So, do you think it's a challenge for co-developing drugs considering that childhood cancers are different from adult cancers in their biology, therapeutic response, and side effect profiles? If you can speak on this.
That's very hard for me to say. I'm more of a data person, economist who does statistical work. I know the biology is different. I know that it involves fewer mutations typically than an adult cancer, and so um, it might make it work better if they're targeting a particular mutation, and the drug can effectively address that, the impacts of that mutation, then it might be more effective. But this is sort of out of my depth, to be quite honest.
Yeah. So, how does this method compare to enrolling adults first, followed by pediatric use secondarily, or just repurposing adult drugs for children in terms of economics?
Yeah, so, well, in terms of economics, if you're looking at it as well, if you're enrolling the kids afterwards as sort of a separate trial, then you have these concerns about whether the benefits in terms of the profits that they get are worth the expenses. And we've seen that there's been very few kids drugs developed, pediatric treatments developed, and so I think we already know to some extent the answer to that question, unless it's funded by a charity or something like that. So I think that the economics make a lot more sense when the pools are combined. Drugs can be repurposed. Um, the issue there is then there's not really a formal trial for it, right? Often there isn't a formal trial, and so you have maybe some doctors who just try giving a drug to a child, and if either way, and this is really hard to say, it's somewhat of a coin flip, right? It's a weighted coin. It might change the probability of heads or tails, but it's still a coin flip. And so, even if a drug helps, there's a good chance that it's not going to necessarily lead to a great outcome. And if you have small numbers, like a very few number of people you're trying this on, you're just not going to learn much of use. So we really need sort of these larger studies or more trials to see what might work. And I think having a few more kids enrolled in these studies, especially if there can be sort of information gleaned from the impact on adults and combined with the information gleaned from kids, I think it can be really powerful.
Right. Why do you think we haven't done more of kind of like the co-developing drugs approach?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Sometimes I think that statisticians want to have as few variables as possible, so a few things changing as possible, and so they might just try and come up with the most direct, simplest study that they can. I really hope that they think about the impacts, right? So yes, it might make it a little bit easier for them or solve a couple issues in terms of the logistics or challenges that they might face, but that's leaving these kids who then just have no new options for treatment, um, and haven't had many for a long time.
Definitely. So, aside from changing approaches to drug development, can you think of any other ways that we could kind of reduce the challenges that childhood cancer survivors face?
Oh gosh. Yeah, I think there's a lot to do on that. Thinking from my own experiences, there's a lot of kids who have sort of multiple issues, and to some extent, you get followed up for something like 5 years after the treatment ends, and if everything is good, then you are sort of passed on to this um, once a year meetings with the oncology team. I haven't heard of any studies of things that can be done after treatment ends, to try and see if there are ways to help these kids long term. I know that it's hard to talk about, but there are a lot of long-term effects, right? You think that your kid has made it, but it made it in a way they didn't die from cancer. But for a lot of these kids, there's lifelong challenges and new challenges that appear because of the treatments that they had. I think a lot more could be done to study these cohorts and see what can be done to help them. Um, yeah, I mean, I know, yeah, there's different from drugs to radiation. We tried to avoid radiation for those reasons, but there's just a lot more to potentially do for those who are actually the lucky ones, but they still have some, unlucky times.
Yes. So, this is unrelated to childhood cancer, but I know you've been really busy with your new book, which
Yeah.
I see in the background, and I just love to hear a bit about what it's about.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's very exciting. So I've been in my academic studies been focusing on the impacts of technological change on the economy for a long time. And now we're going through this period of dramatic disruption. It hasn't exactly happened yet, but it's coming, I think, in this next year. Um, so there's a lot of impacts. There's the impacts of AI, or sort of the perceived impacts of AI, impacts of digitization, of privacy reductions. And so I've been going to various conferences that have been focusing on the impacts of technological changes for about 2 decades. And I thought it'd be fun to turn that into a book. So I tried to write a book that was accessible to a general audience. It was really trying to give an introduction to these various topics and be written in a fun way, really trying to make it an entertaining way to learn more about AI. It was written with the assistance of AI. So AI was my sort of secret co-author. And I thought that would it actually worked pretty well. It was not quite as efficient as I'd hoped, but it worked pretty well. And I thought, how can I write a book about the future of technological change without employing it in the production process myself? Um,
Yeah, that's really cool. That's kind of the end of our questions.
okay.
Thank you so much.